Chapter 8. Oblivious to Illyrian's designs against his life, Tazir Madakin slipped through the undergrowth and debris of the Kaiwald forest. Long ago he had sacrificed attempts at stealth in favor of speed. More recently, fatigue had forced him to just concentrate on continuing to move through stands of beech, oak, and chestnut. Nothing seemed to change. Trees blurred to more trees. No longer did he see beauty in the forest or derive pleasure from birdsongs. Moonbear's frequent disappearances to scout or pick the wild berries which had sustained them through the day ceased to concern Tazir. Memories of gang fellows and exhilarating thefts obsessed him, and I can't ever return home. Sadness enveloped Tazir. A city child from birth, he had never learned to appreciate the true wonders of the forest. Illyrian's deceit and his own love of action had wrenched him suddenly and cruelly from the only world he knew, his life, his loves, and his friends. He wondered how Shylar fared now, and hoped his presence and the guard Moonbear had killed had not gotten her into trouble. He smiled at his own concern. Shylar had spent too many years aiding the underground to become a casualty of the Baron's manhunt. Engrossed in thought, Tazir did not realize he was once again alone, nor that he had passed through a clustered pine and into a clearing. A crackle of branches to his right startled him. He turned. A man emerged from the brush. He towered over Tazir, his arms thick as fence posts. His hair hung in wild disarray, his eyes fixed on Tazir, blue and demanding. He clutched a spear, its tip angled at Tazir's chest. Tazir recoiled with a surprised gasp. He held his hands outstretched and away from his sword hilt, indicating surrender. He backstepped. The movement nearly impaled him on another spear behind him. He whirled to face a man enough like the first to be a brother. Tazir cried out in alarm. Even as he turned to run, 8 more spearmen stepped out from the forest, trapping him in the clearing. Guardsmen? Tazir shook his head in disbelief. People in the country surrounding Collinsburg sported dark hair and features, yet these woodland soldiers all seemed fair and blond, and spears had never proved a popular weapon in Collinsburg's army. A muscular redhead jabbed his spear toward Tazir and spoke in a strange language with a heavy accent, reminiscent of Moonbear's. The circle closed. Tazir tasted sweat. He shook his head to indicate he did not understand. My name is Tazir Madakin. I mean you no harm. Lacking skill with a sword and surrounded by warriors, Tazir realized the absurdity of his reassurances. The spearmen shifted and whispered to one another. Momentarily, Tazir suspected they would laugh at his name as Moonbear had in Shylar's tavern. The thought reminded him of his companion's absence. Moonbear? Moonbear? From beyond the tightening ring of soldiers, Moonbear's gruff reply was unintelligible to Tazir, but the spearmen turned at the sound of the barbarian's voice. Mainbjorn. The word swept through their ranks like an echo. Several of the spearmen dropped to their knees. Tazir read anger in Moonbear's next utterance. As one, the warriors leaped to their feet and rushed down upon the Swedish barbarian. Helpless against men in such numbers, Tazir feared for Moonbear's life. But the first man who reached him dropped his spear and embraced Moonbear. The others pressed around the 2 men, chattering excitedly. No longer endangered, Tazir waited with patient curiosity until the reunion amenities were finished. Moonbear pushed past his friends to Tazir's side. Still speaking the northern tongue, Moonbear made an introduction in which he called Tazir by a name which sounded uncomfortably like sugar. He then addressed his companion. These are my Danish cousins. We've entered the forest your people will call the Danwald Wilderness. My cousins have invited us to their camp for supper and a story. Tazir thought, some friendly invite. His gut ached with a hunger berries could not satisfy, but caution overshadowed his desire for food. I appreciate their kindness and the fact that they chose to let me live, but do we have time to spare for tales? We are safe with Deer Runner's tribe, and we would insult them if we refused. Tazir studied the fur-clad, hardened barbarians and decided offending them would not be wise. Then I guess we joined them with pleasure. Moonbear communicated their acceptance. The Danwaldian barbarians funneled into the woods, sweeping Tazir and Moonbear along with them. What was that name you called me? Tazir questioned as they walked. Skiggy. Moonbear spelled it out for Tazir, but he still pronounced it like sugar. It means shadow. Tazir went silent, surprised Moonbear could read. Although both of Tazir's occupations required such knowledge, few of Collinsburg's citizenry could master printing more complicated than a tavern sign. Again, Tizir realized how Guard's stories of barbarians and his own early judgment of Moonbear's intelligence still influenced his opinion. The spearmen led Tizir and Moonbear along narrow trails and through brush which seemed impenetrable. The barbarians traversed the densest copses with animal grace and quietness. Despite a day of practice, Tizir still felt as awkward as a zebra steed in comparison. He dogged Moonbear's steps, but branches jabbed like daggers, brambles tore through the linen of his cloak, and scratched welts into his back. Soon the aroma of roasting meat and potatoes intermingled with smells less familiar to Tizir. The barbarian warriors entered camp into a clearing ringed with pine. In its center, half a dozen golden-haired women tended a huge cooking pit. Nearby, several others hacked roots, stems, and nuts with curved copper knives. Children of varying ages scurried about the camp. The older males sparred under the watchful eye of a wizened, white-haired man who seemed unusually spry for his years. Other warriors guarded the perimeter, but they left their posts as Moonbear entered the camp. Moonbear inclined his head toward the elderly swordsman. "That is Prince Deer Runner. I have matters to discuss with him and his men. You wait here." He motioned toward the fire. Tizir watched Deer Runner jog toward them. "Prince?" He tossed his head in disbelief. "Their king must be ancient." Obediently, Tizir wandered to the indicated position, while the warriors converged on Moonbear. Even as Tizir started to hunker down, he found himself surrounded by children. Surprised by the youngster's boldness, Tizir remained standing while they poked and prodded his clothing. A girl seized his hand and traced the calluses gained from years of climbing, which must seem idly placed at children accustomed to warriors. A boy no older than 10 positioned himself beside Tizir. Apparently noticing that their friend stood as tall as the foreigner, the children giggled. Embarrassed by their laughter, Tizir sat in the dirt. Immediately, a toddler climbed into his lap, and the youngsters squatted around him. Feeling obligated to entertain, Tizir spoke. "Hello, He tried to imitate Moonbear's sing-song pronunciation. "Shiogur." The children broke into laughter. The toddler giggled so hard she fell from Tizir's lap. Tizir flushed, hoping he had not called himself something obscene. Seeking a means to distract his over-appreciative audience, he thrust his hands into his pockets. His fingers closed around Mordath's jadestone. He whisked it into his palm. Immediately his mind filled with images of the blonde woman who had haunted his dreams the previous night. Her beauty aroused curiosity and interest, obscuring the question of why her image suddenly had appeared in his mind. Some trick of magic allowed the vision to remain in Tizir's thoughts, until it faded gradually to gray. Abruptly, Tizir realized displaying a sorcerer's toy before a tribe of barbarian warriors might not be prudent. He flicked the stone into his sleeve. The toddler squealed excitedly. She caught Tizir's hand and turned it questioningly. The youngsters all started talking simultaneously. Realizing his sleight of hand had not gone unnoticed, Tizir palmed the jade. Placing his hand on the toddler, he pretended to retrieve the green stone from the folds of her sewn skin garment. The children clapped delightedly. Shouting praises Tizir could not understand, they urged him to continue. Repeatedly, the thief made the gemstone disappear. Each time he would reclaim it from a different child in a new location. Once an eye, then an ear, then a foot. At last, tiring of the game, he pressed the jadestone back into his pocket. He looked past the children to the warriors who still conversed in a huddle. A gruff command from one of the women by the cook fire dispersed the children. The women crushed in on Tizir. Several sat before him, offering handfuls of berries, roots, or nut meats. Others crouched beside him, examining the fabric of his worn and tattered cloak. One raked her fingers through his fine black hair. Not wanting to offend them, Tizir accepted several chestnuts. The woman from whom he took them cried out in triumph. The others pressed closer. Suddenly, Tizir realized they were competing for his attention, as if the regard of a stranger somehow raised each woman's status above the others. Bombarded with food and embraces, Tizir tried valiantly to divide his interest equally. Small and thin, shamed by his father's presumed cowardice, Tizir had never found a woman of his own, but Shylar encouraged her girls to bed Tizir in exchange for his generosity. Now, weeks from his last sexual encounter, he found the barbarian's caresses exciting. He felt a tingling sensation in his groin. Before he could think of fighting it, he had an erection. Tizir winced and crossed his legs, mortified at his own arousal. "Moonbear," he called feebly. He glanced toward the men, distressingly aware of the brawny forms of the women's husbands. "I'm dead." Feigning excessive interest in the pro-offered food, Tizir shifted uncomfortably and wished he knew how to say homosexual in the northern tongue. While Tazir struggled with the consequences of the women's kindness, the warriors' meeting broke. The men headed toward the central campfire. The large redhead Tazir thought was their captain shouted at a woman to Tazir's right. She caught the Collinsbergen's arm and called back to the barbarian. In response, the man strode toward them. Tazir disentangled himself from the women and struggled to his feet. Concerned for his life, he unsuccessfully sought to find Moonbear among the crowd of returning warriors. His skin prickled with apprehension. He realized he was shaking. The warrior marched closer. Tazir said nothing, aware he had no words to defend himself from the other men. The women moved aside or walked to the cooking pit. Only the one who had instigated the conflict remained. The redhead stopped and studied Tazir in a shadow-dappled afternoon sunlight. He raised a hand the size of a guard lion's paw and swung at Tazir. Surprised by the boldness of the barbarian's attack, Tazir sprang away. The blow caught him across the arm. Off balance, he staggered. He tensed to flee, but the barbarian's laughter and a firm hand clapped to his shoulder filled Tazir with relief. The redhead addressed him in a loud but sociable voice. Tazir realized the backslap had not been an assault, but a show of companionship from a man accustomed to more solid friends. Tazir managed a weak smile. For lack of a better reply to the red-haired barbarian's unrecognizable statement, he simply said, "Thank you." The barbarian and his woman trotted toward the cooking fire. Tazir watched them with such intensity he did not notice Moonbear's presence until the barbarian spoke. "Flamehair told you, women only cause trouble." Tazir turns to Moonbear. Though not yet ready to generalize in the current situation, Tazir could only agree with the assessment. Flamehair has a point. He noticed his friend held a huge chunk of meat, too big for one man's supper. "Hungry?" Moonbear waved Tazir to the ground and sat beside him. He tore the steak into two nearly equal portions and passed half to Tazir. "Eat well. This may be your last good meal for some time." The roots and berries Tazir had consumed during his encounter with the Danish women had taken the edge from his hunger, but he accepted the meat from Moonbear. Warm grease dripped from his fingers. Following Moonbear's cue, he took a bite. It tasted much like pork, but the absence of sinew and gristle made it remarkably tender. Tazir swallowed. "What sort of animal is this?" Moonbear gulped his own mouthful before replying. "It is bear." Tazir continued eating. Around the clearing, barbarian men and women reclined in couples and groups, each with his own piece of meat. The females took turns offering raw or roasted roots, stems, berries, and nuts. "Are these people always so friendly?" Moonbear stopped one of the wandering women and speared potatoes for himself and Tazir. "They know you are my friend. It's important to them that you like them." Tazir wiped his fingers on an edge of his cloak. "Please assure them I do, and let them know I appreciate their efforts." Prince Deer Runner rose from his meal and crossed to the front of the camp. He raised his arm and conversation ceased. Moonbear whispered, "Hush now. Deer Runner will tell a tale." Hugging food to their bellies, the children threaded toward Deer Runner and took seats before him. The adults turned to face him. Even Moonbear ate with rapt attention to the prince, and, while Tazir found Deer Runner's inflections interesting, he could not comprehend a word of the story. The scene revived images of Collinsberg's old beggar who would sit on the alehouse stairs and tell vivid accounts for a few coppers or the price of a beer. In his early days on the streets, Tazir and his gang companions would rob the peasants who stood listening. On a good day, Tazir would glean enough copper or silver to buy his dinner and pay the beggar what his stories were really worth. As Deer Runner's story unfurled, Tazir finished his meal. Memories of Collinsberg reminded him once again that he could never return home. The events of the last few days replayed through his thoughts, and images of the battle in Carl's tavern appeared to him in detail. "I still can't believe I watched while Moonbear could have died." Guilt prickled the edges of his consciousness. He suppressed his urge to mentally defend his actions. "I do not know how to fight. My father taught me to protect Mother in his absence. Surely I could hold my own, at least against a single opponent." Tazir pictured himself engaged in battle with a uniformed member of the Baron's army. Immediately, an image formed of his mother's body, blood-smeared, dead at her son's own hand. The bear meat churned in Tazir's gut. He felt nauseated. He knew it was not his own death he feared. Too many times in the course of his thefts, his demise had seemed a certainty, but his conscience would not allow him to take another's life. Restless, Tazir whispered, "Would I offend Deer Runner if I found a quiet corner to practice sword forms until he finishes?" Moonbear never shifted his gaze from the Danish prince. "No one will mind." Tizir rose and trotted to the far border of the clearing. He unsheathed his sword. Its steel appeared gray as ash amid the shadows of the trees. Attempting to recall his father's myriad instructions, he executed a simple kata. The action flowed smoothly, without need of conscious thought. Too easy. Tizir knew whenever a maneuver felt comfortable, he had made a mistake. The elder Madakin had complained most frequently that Tizir dropped his right shoulder on the strike. He repositioned and tried again. Though less satisfying, the maneuver felt correct. For a time, Tizir continued his practice, but Moonbear's arrival with Prince Deerrunner cut the lesson short. Moonbear spoke. Deerrunner wishes to talk with you before our departure. Hurriedly, Tizir slid his sword into his sheath. Uncertain whether to bow or kneel, he stood still and met Deerrunner's stare. The prince's eyes were as sharp and gray as the distant crags. Deerrunner uttered a few short words, and Moonbear translated. He welcomes you to his tribe. Thank him for me. Moonbear and Deerrunner exchanged sentences. Moonbear explained. He asked where you come from, and I told him. He wants to know if you served in the Baron's army. Shaken by the direction of Deerrunner's questioning, Tizir replied quickly. Please, tell him no. Again Moonbear passed conversation with Deerrunner in the northern tongue. He then addressed Tizir. He wants to know if your gods fought in the wars. The statement floored Tizir. My what? Moonbear chuckled at his own mistake. Your ancestors. The words mean the same in our language. Though intrigued by this concept, Tizir found the prince's query more pressing. He considered for some time before attempting a reply. Moonbear, I can't lie to you. I still feel guilty teaching you thief is an honorable profession. Unnerved by the information he was passing to Moonbear, he fidgeted. My father led the Baron's troops during the barbarian wars, but, by Mardane's mercy, don't tell Deerrunner. Moonbear accepted the confession with unexpected composure. He conveyed some information to Deerrunner. The Danwaldian's reply was brief. Moonbear switched to the Baronese language. He says your father was a brave warrior. All color drained from Tizir. His fingers knotted into bloodless fists. Uncertain which shocked him more, Moonbear's direct betrayal of his request or the prince's reply. Tizir stammered. My father killed his people. Why would Deerrunner praise an enemy? Moonbear drew breath to reply, but Deerrunner laid a hand on his arm. The old prince spoke in an awkward, broken form of the Baronese tongue, yet his voice still commanded respect. Your father, warrior. He chose enemies, not. Baron did. He stepped toward Tizir. Your father, warrior, slaughtered not women, children. Burned not. Cut apart not our gods. Moonbear clarified. He means your father's soldiers never dishonored our dead. Tizir chewed his lower lip, suspecting Deerrunner understood much more the language than he could speak. Moonbear answered Tizir's unspoken question. Deerrunner knew the answers before he questioned you. He wanted to see if you would reply truthfully. Tizir recalled how he had identified himself when the barbarians surrounded him in the first clearing. He recognized me from the moment I entered camp. Why didn't he have me slain? Moonbear and Deerrunner stared, apparently finding his query ludicrous. The day the wars ended, my cousins no longer wished your father any harm. But even had he killed children, like the men of other troops, how could we hold that offense against you? Would your people punish you for another man's crime? They might. Tizir hesitated, unable to find the words to explain stereotypes and prejudice. For generations, guards' tales of barbarians' ferocity and cruelties had sparked hatred against the wild men throughout the barony. Enveloped by an emotion he could not name, Tizir felt as if he had always watched life's procession through a reflecting pool. Now a pebble had fallen into its waters, and, after the ripples subsided, the world's image would no longer be the same. Thinking back, Tizir could not recall his father ever speaking specifically of the barbarians. He limited his tales to descriptions of guard work, soldiers, war, and its consequences. But some of the guardsmen spoke freely on the streets and in the taverns. They glorified their own efforts in the battles and referred to the barbarians as animals. Reminded of the mistreatment of a beggar woman in Collinsburg streets, Tizir wondered who more aptly deserved the insult. Yet, still fiercely loyal to his own people, Tizir pushed aside his judgment against them. He found himself with nothing to say. A warrior dressed in bearskin with animal claws, braided into his hair, rushed to Deerrunner's side. As he spoke, he gesticulated wildly. Drawn from his thoughts, Tizir watched the three barbarians converse. Shortly, Moonbear translated, "The scouts have identified guards from the barony. They're tracking us with hounds. Recently, the horsemen split off from the others, and now they are rapidly closing the distance between us." Tizir cursed. Aware Deer Runner knew his language, he suppressed the urge to chastise Moonbear for wasted time. With a conspiratorial smile, Deer Runner addressed Moonbear in the northern tongue. In response, Moonbear's face darkened. His reply seemed uncharacteristically angry. The Swede caught Tizir's sleeve and jerked him toward the woods. Tizir hastened after Moonbear, pausing only long enough to toss one sentence over his shoulder. "You're good people." Tizir caught up with Moonbear a few paces into the brush. Before he could ask, the barbarian explained his odd behavior. Deer Runner suggested his warriors fend off the guard patrol while we escape. Tizir wrestled with branches, wondering why Deer Runner's kind offer enraged his companion. "What did you say?" "I forbade it." Moonbear paused to keep from moving too far ahead of Tizir. "You saw nearly all that remains of Deer Runner's great tribe. They lost many brave men and women to the war. The forest shows their children no mercy." Moonbear hunched through a dense overgrowth. "If my time to die is come, I accept it. I will not have even one innocent life lost for me." The tangle of untraveled brush closed in on Tizir, his efforts to break through it drenching him with sweat. Though he knew Moonbear was right, he felt less certain of his own ability to evade hounds and horses. It came to him suddenly that Moonbear could escape far more quickly without him. Surely the political aspects of a prince's ransom outweigh the consequences of my theft. If we separated, the soldiers would probably track Moonbear. He might be able to elude them alone. Even as the option presented itself to Tizir's mind, it raised another issue. Moonbear's presence and Mordath's jadestone in his pocket had become his last links with a familiar civilization. Without a guide or a hunter's knowledge, Tizir might perish in a forest long before he came upon a town. Plagued by these thoughts, Tizir worked his way through the brush as quickly as possible. When he again caught up with Moonbear, he phrased his confusion as a question. "Moonbear, how do you make a difficult decision?" Moonbear replied without hesitation. "I asked the advice of my father." Tizir shied from a bramble patch. Not much help here. Besides, my father is dead." "Mine too." Tizir and Moonbear swam through a final growth of briars to emerge into a less clustered area of forest. "What? Could you repeat that?" Moonbear paused, staring at the peaks which obscured the northern horizon. "We will need to veer east to find a crossing through the Colding Hills, and I said my father is also dead." Intrigued by the paradox, Tizir questioned further. "If he died, how can you speak with him?" Moonbear continued toward the crags. "I simply think what I want to say. It is that easy." Tizir scrambled after his companion. "I suppose so, but surely you don't think he answers you?" "Always." "Forgive my ignorance, but how does a dead man talk?" "It's hard to explain. Try it. Ask your father a question." "Fine." Feeling foolish, Tizir concentrated on his dilemma. Should I remain with Moonbear, or would we both be safer apart? The redirection of his thoughts raised a flurry of emotion. He had grown to like the barbarian and his people. He felt a loyalty to his huge companion which transcended common sense. "I've promised to bring him home safely. I owe him my life. Yet my slowness may cost him his." Moonbear interrupted Tizir's train of thought. "Did you ask him?" Tizir ducked beneath a fallen tree. "Yes." "And he answered?" Tizir broke into a trot. The forest was thinning and the ground became more rocky as they approached the Colding Hills. Now he could discern distant rolling rises carpeted with greenery. The crag he'd mistaken for mountains was the bare granite on a single vertical fault. "Of course not. He's dead." Moonbear quickened his pace. "He answered, 'You do not know how to listen.' Right after he stated your problem, did you find an answer which came straight from your heart, the option which required no thought?" "Yes, but that came from me." Moonbear snorted. "You do not know how to listen." As Tizir and Moonbear approached the granite cliff, they headed eastward. Tizir considered his next argument, recalling how his father used to chastise him for responding without thought. The best verbal offense consists of deep reflection and careful wording. Nothing unnerves an opponent more than a long-drawn pause. Even as Captain Tizir's suggestion emerged in his memory, the shadow climber realized Moonbear was right. More than once in the past, Tizir had turned to memories of his dead father for solace and direction. Perhaps you have a point. Is that why our language uses God, dead, and ancestor interchangeably? Now Moonbear hesitated. We believe our ancestors have a great influence over us and the world. We learn from them. Tazir smiled. Finally, a religion which makes sense to me. Each man has his own personal god to watch over him. There's no organization or rules, no temple, and no greedy priests to wring money from his followers. His thoughts took a different turn. If your father died, doesn't that make you king? Prince, Moonbear corrected. My father is king. When I am killed, I shall take his place. I hope I can do as well as he. He broke off suddenly, listening. Tazir noted Moonbear's distraction. What do you hear? Moonbear replied softly, but his single word carried the force of a whip crack. Hounds. Anxiety ground through Tazir. Within seconds, he too could hear the dogs yapping with murderous eagerness. Though distant, the sound carried a deadly promise of a bowman's volley. Every tendon in his neck pulled taut. Come on. He ran, straight for the vertical rock formation. He had no other destination. The hounds had found their fresh scent, and there was no time to seek a pass. After a few steps, Tazir felt the familiar wild rush of euphoria. His race to the cliff face brought memories of adventurous thefts and impossible escapes. Always before he'd found a way out, whether through a tight hole, a crack, or a door. But as he drew near the fault, he could tell that in places it stood sheerer than any wall he had ever scaled. He paused at the base, aware he left Moonbear behind in his haste. The baying of the hounds grew louder. Tazir waited only until Moonbear drew to his side. Up. There's no other way to go. He started climbing the white-gray rubble. Moonbear hesitated, apparently as unfamiliar with ascending granite as Tazir was with forests. Picking his route carefully, he followed. Tazir knew frustration. He took the first few ledges at a run. At the level of the treetops, Tazir saw the lead dog broach the forest. A Garen's blood. Goaded to reckless speed, Tazir forced his concentration on each handhold. The climbing grew more difficult. Pits and crags became more sparse the higher he went. In his haste, he seized a loose stone for support. It wrenched free, tumbling down the cliff face. Tazir fell. His throat pinched close, strangling his cry. He scrabbled for a hold. His fingernails shattered. Pain jarred through his hands. From habit, the calloused edges of his fingers caught faults in the granite. Pressed to the stone, Tazir felt his heart pound a rapid cadence. He heard a horse's whinny and a man's shout, but he dared not take the time to look. He continued his climb. Each new hold a full deliberate movement. He pulled himself up to a rock-strewn shelf. He could hear Moonbear a short distance below him on the cliffs. A straight stretch of stone rose above Tazir, smooth as a polished jadestone in his pocket. Discouragement assailed Tazir. Cornered against unscalable stone, he was reminded of his imprisonment in the Baron's dungeon without hope of escape. But Tazir would not accept despair. He examined the slick granite with the intensity of a hunting hawk. As Moonbear pulled up beside Tazir, the thief's search was rewarded by the discovery of a minuscule fissure, which ran the remaining length of the cliff face, scarcely large enough to admit Tazir's fingers. A late summer wind blustered around Tazir, snapping the hem of his cloak. Desperation drove him to remember the youthful boast of his gang members. Tazir Madakin could climb an icicle. Burdened with the obligation of 2 lives, Tazir swore to achieve the impossible. Wedging his fingers into the cleft, he hugged the granite wall. The jagged sides of the crack scraped skin from his digits. Using the sides of his feet for what little traction they could offer, he inched his way up the cliff side. Effort fired elation through Tazir. Blood trickled along his hands, but he felt no pain. Grim concentration narrowed his world to the surface of stone. Each new hand grasp was a triumph. 40 feet of granite cliff seemed to span miles. Still, Tazir edged upward. Dried grasses tickled through Tazir's hair. Clinging to what little surface the crevice allowed, he groped with one hand. His fingers crested the rise. With a grunt of realization, he hurled his body over the top. He lay in a thin layer of brush, staring at a gray-streaked early evening sky and a nearby line of pine and birch. Dirt clotted his eyelashes. Pain descended like a wasp swarm. Limbs aching, he pushed to his feet and gazed into the valley. At least 20 mounted soldiers spread across the flatlands. Hounds jabbered at the base of the cliff. Some had clambered to the lower ledges. Trapped on the shelf below Tazir, Moonbear fingered a gathered pile of rocks, a defense against men or dogs who dare the climb. Tazir hollered to Moonbear, "Stay there, I'll find a better route." Sparked with urgency, he ran along the hilltop. His flight nearly carried him into a man. A sudden sidestep was all that saved them both from collision. Surprised to find another person so far from civilization, Tazir studied the stranger. He was tall and thick. Lines of hardship creased his features. His closely cropped dark hair sported a tinge of red. Dried sweat and plant sap darkened his buckskins. He carried a leather bow case and a full quiver. A sword graced his hip. Tazir read relief and interest in the man's demeanor. The hunter spoke first. "Ho, child, what's your hurry?" The howls of the hounds cut Tazir like knives. It was not in his nature to trust a stranger, but dire necessity usurped caution. If the bowman carried something as simple as a rope, Moonbear's life and freedom might be spared. "My friend is trapped on a ledge." The stranger seemed remarkably calm. "Show me." Hurriedly, Tazir led his new acquaintance to Moonbear. In the valley below, several of the cavalrymen had drawn bows, but none dared to fire. Tazir watched as the man in buckskin judged the distance to Moonbear. Then, with enviable composure, he traced the distance to the timber line. He singled out a tall yellow pine, freed his sword, and brandished it like an axe. Tazir's breath caught in his throat. His voice emerged as a hoarse croak. "What are you doing?" The sword bit twice into the tree trunk. With a groan, the pine leaned toward the cliff face. Suddenly, the stranger's plan seemed morbidly clear to Tazir. Careful to stay clear of the falling timber, Tazir raced to the crest. "Moonbear!" he shouted. The blade thunked against the wood. Moonbear looked up. He dove aside. The tree top crashed to the ledge. Its upper branches pummeled him to the shelf. Tazir shouted, "Karan is hell! You crazed maniac! You could have killed him!" He watched Moonbear stagger to his feet. The remaining wood grain held the pine in place while Moonbear climbed its jutting branches as easily as a ladder. At the base of the cliff, the guardsmen scrambled to the lower ledges in pursuit. The stranger muttered, "Idiots." He waited until Moonbear gained the crest, then splintered the last few strands of wood from the stump. The tree clattered down the cliff face, smashing hounds like toys. The guardsmen sprang aside. Their zebra steeds scattered across the valley. Tazir drew a ragged breath. For now, they were safe. The Baron's men would need to regroup and find a passage through the crags. Likely, they would wait for their infantry, gaining Tazir and Moonbear more time. Recognizing the nearness of their escape, Tazir resolved not to underestimate the army's power again. Moonbear's voice broke through Tazir's troubled maze of thought. "Shadow." He made a broad sweep of his arm, beckoning Tazir toward the timber line. Tazir approached Moonbear and his new companion. Recalling the barbarian's disdain of appreciative gestures for actions he considered simple courtesy, Tazir drew the burden of graciousness upon himself. He met the stranger's eyes. They were the soft brown of a deer's. "I'm sorry I yelled at you. Thanks for saving Moonbear." Not wishing to explain his alias, Tazir introduced himself with the same name Moonbear had used. "They call me Shadow." The stranger spoke with the blunt abrasiveness of one unused to company. "Erdmore, why are you running from Collinsburg's army?" Tazir ignored the question, trying to decoy Erdmore with one of his own. "You from Collinsburg?" "Once," Erdmore confessed. "Years ago I served in their army. That was back when the commanders did more than babysit." Tazir seized the opportunity to steer the conversation completely away from himself. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked, more to ascertain that Erdmore had no companions than from real curiosity. Erdmore thumbed his bow case. "I'm a hunter and woodsman. I live out here alone. Right now, I'm also a traveler headed for Norway. My sister's getting married." Before Tazir could stop to think, Moonbear spoke. "We're headed in the same direction. Want to join us?" Tazir stifled a gasp, wishing his companion was less trusting. "Moon," he said slowly, as if chastising a child, "we're not looking for company." "Neither am I," Erdmore snorted. "The last thing I need is a troop of half-trained soldiers trailing me and a pair of fugitives." He pointed upward. "And I'm not happy about him either." Tazir peered into the sky. A hawk circled the clouds, eagerly revealing their position. "What's it doing?" "Telling the world where to find you." Erdmore followed the bird with his gaze. "It's a carahawk. Years ago, men taught its forebears to hunt both game and renegade slaves. Even after their handlers released them, the hawks continued to pass the old signals to their fledglings." Tazir frowned. "So you knew we were here?" Erdmore met Tazir's stare. "Of course, the hawk told me." He pointed upward. "And I was curious what sort of man could climb a straight cliff face. I guess even an old soldier hasn't seen everything." Pleased with Erdmore's backhanded compliment, Tazir relented. The woodsman's confidence and no-nonsense attention to detail reminded Tazir of his father. Perhaps we do have need of a quick thinker, who is also observant and knows the woods. He did save Moonbear's life and slow the patrol, and we seem to share a common dislike for Collinsburg's soldiers. You're welcome to join us, Aird Moore. If we come with you, at least your trip won't be boring. The guards want us dead. Does the reason really matter? Aird Moore looked over the crags and studied the carnage below with a strange smile. I hadn't planned on company, but camp for 3 is no more difficult than for 1, and there's more people to share the work. I doubt those soldiers will prove much trouble. Come on, I'll show you a short route to Port Kalmar. He strode eastward. Thinking he had gained a valuable ally, Tazir followed. Chapter 9. A vague familiarity had plagued Illyrian nearly from the time Mordath joined Salik's patrol. It seemed as if he had met the dragon maid sometime in the past. The thought was surely madness. A short distance from the sleeping soldiers, Illyrian watched Mordath slouch over a rectangle traced in the dirt at the edge of the dam-walled wilderness. Surely I would recall an encounter with a legend. His arrogance alone is memorable. Yet the memory remained elusive. Illyrian could only assume he was mistaken. Night cloaked Mordath in shadow, broken by a line of moonlight which glittered through his golden hair. His eyes flicked closed in concentration. Hunched and intent, he wore an expression of vulnerability which reawakened Illyrian's feelings of twice meeting. Before him, the shape in the dust glimmered. Harsh white light shot through the matrix, then muted to a wavering pattern of gray and black. Illyrian stared blank with shock. Mordath leaned closer until his face nearly touched his sorceries. North and east, the dragon rank informed his companion. The pattern on the ground winked. As if emerging from a dark tunnel to regain sight, Illyrian watched images take shape in the dirt. A flickering fire lit a camp in a stand of scrub pine. He easily identified the men stretched or curled on the ground. Aird Moore lay with an arm curled around his bow. Moonbear slept in a crouched position which looked uncomfortable. The borders of Mordath's spell neatly decapitated Tazir. Mordath explained, I focused on the Swede. We saw the others because they happened to be nearby. He dispelled his magics with a wave. They've hardly moved from the cliff. Illyrian frowned, recalling how he, Salik, and Mordath had arrived with the infantry to find most of the hounds dead and 2 of the cavalrymen injured. They didn't need to go far after they finished playing with Salik's second-in-command and his men. The possibility of manipulating Mordath to help gain control of the army convinced Illyrian to sow the first seeds of dissent. Collinsburg's soldiers are fierce and noble fighters. They would fare far better with capable leadership. He regarded Mordath's face for any hint that his treasonous utterance had overstepped boundaries. But Mordath's feline eyes had gone dull. His proud head sagged. Initially, Illyrian assumed the long, hard journey had tired the dragon rank mage, but the change seemed too sudden and too soon after the location spell to be coincidence. Illyrian realized the use of sorceries taxed Mordath's physical endurance, and the wizard's humble pose suddenly sparked a memory. Illyrian recalled a day, years ago, when a young Norseman entered Vestberg near Illyrian's father's estate. Disheveled and dirty, he had not been welcomed by the populace, but his mission piqued Illyrian's curiosity. The Norseman sought to slay Aird Moore, a pursuit which fell within Illyrian's own designs. The shy, eager Norseman of his memory bore little resemblance to the haughty sorcerer now before him. Yet Illyrian realized they were one and the same. He also dredged reason from recollection, a sister's thwarted marriage and a newborn child. Seeking to sunder any residual loyalties between Aird Moore and Mordath, Illyrian took advantage of his newly recovered information and the sorcerer's current weakness. Unpredictable bastard, he muttered. Having gained Mordath's attention, he continued with more volume. Have you noticed Aird Moore already plots against us? He's so damned vengeful. He dropped a tree on our cavalry because he dislikes a single soldier. Surely he could have ingratiated himself with the fugitives without taking our men's lives. Mordath nodded without replying. His features appeared drawn. Illyrian drove home his point. One of the cavalrymen heard Aird Moore shout something about killing an old lover who'd ruined his child. Can you imagine any sane man holding a grudge like that? Mordath jerked to attention. His fatigue seemed to disappear, but the hand which gripped his dragon staff trembled slightly. Which man told you this? Illyrian tossed his head and named the soldier he knew could most easily be bribed. Herwig, but he may have misunderstood with the hounds barking in the distance. He adopted an expression of innocence, secretly thrilled by Mordath's obvious discomfort. Perhaps, Mordath said, but his tone precluded the possibility. For now, we sleep, but my patience has worn thin. I won't tolerate incompetence. If Ardmore has not led the gem-stealing insect and his friend within our grasp, by this time tomorrow we'll find them. They'll be dead, and the Jadestone returned my possession, if I have to lead these men myself. Illyrian's lips turned upward in a thin smile. Morning dawned over the Colding Hills, its glory dampened by a veil of clouds. Completely disoriented, Tazir awoke to the smell of cooking meat. For an instant, he thought he lay on a pallet in Shylar's whorehouse, but the floor carried an aroma of moist earth, and the acrid reek of the campfire roused him more fully. He opened his eyes. Ardmore and Moonbear conversed over the flames, speaking too softly for Tazir to understand. His neck ached. He had slept with his head propped against a log. Every leaf and twig seemed to have left a permanent impression on his back. Tazir rose and raked knotted black hair from his eyes. Good morning. He joined his companions at the fire. Ardmore roasted strips of rabbit over a green twig. Moonbear waved in greeting. Ardmore merely grunted. He picked meat from his stick with his fingers and passed a few strands to Tazir. Thank you. Tazir accepted the food gratefully, now glad to have a hunter among the party. He ate in silence while Ardmore packed up his bow and prepared for departure. They traveled east. The sun glared in their eyes despite the scattered trunks. Yet, after days spent in dense forest and brush, Tazir welcomed its blinding intensity. At least he no longer had any difficulty keeping up with his forest-seasoned companions. He remained pensively silent while Moonbear and Ardmore argued directions. Ardmore insisted he lived in the area, and therefore knew the best way to call Marport. Moonbear's rejoinder that he had traversed the route just prior to his troubles in Cullensburg was not as convincing. Therefore, the morning was passed following Ardmore's shortcut, with no heed given to the barbarian's suggestion to veer northward. Life in the woodlands gave Ardmore and Moonbear many interests in common. By midday, Tazir had found no opportunity to speak. Jealousy twinged through him at the fast friendship which had developed between his companions. At a lull in their talk, before they could once again begin to dispute the route, Tazir addressed Ardmore. Your idea to rescue Moonbear with a tree was quick thinking. Ardmore shrugged off the compliment. I've done it before, boy. War makes men resourceful. Excited at the possibility of finding another man who might have served with his father, Tazir did not take the time to phrase his query appropriately. What was it like? The war, I mean. Did you enjoy it? Ardmore stopped dead. Enjoy? He repeated the word louder. Enjoy. Suddenly, his control burst. His calm and cautious exterior crumbled, admitting a raging beast with little resemblance to the stranger Tazir had met on the cliff. Would you enjoy stewing in summer sweat, 2 days shy of food, waiting for a sullen enemy to come and kill you? Would you enjoy having friends bleed to death in your arms? Could you find enjoyment in taking the lives of fathers and sons in the cause of advancing the Baron's lands a few fingers' breadth farther into the forest? Wrenched by the verbal onslaught, Tazir cringed away. Hey, I'm sorry, I really didn't mean... But the gates of Ardmore's conscience had opened wide, and could not be easily shut again. However, his tone did become less accusatory and more regretful. We killed them, they killed us. We fought for small gains in territory. They sought to save the only home they had. Their copper swords and spears were no match for steel, but it was their forest and they knew it. With predatory patience, they would fade beyond sight in the woodlands, then pepper us with arrows or slay us in our sleep. Ardmore continued eastward. Surprised by the ferocity and bitterness of his words, Tazir followed in silence. Our men were of two types, those who served the Baron and those who served his money. Our survivors also embodied two kinds of soldiers, men who learned from the forest and cowards. Ardmore's mouth formed a quiet smile. When the Baron finally realized he lost the majority of his true warriors to death and many more to desertion, he called us in, no richer for land or gold. Horror etched Tazir's features. None of his father's descriptions had prepared him for Ardmore's revelations. Ardmore spoke more softly as if to himself. Despite our failure, the populace greeted us as heroes. Heroes. He bit back a sarcastic laugh, and his voice again gained volume, as if ripping men's guts with the point of a sword makes you special. But heroes they called us, and the consequences of our mass murder they called glory. He addressed his ear directly, no longer angry. Boy, glory is a farce, an abstraction. It has no meaning. It exists only to allow weak men and statesmen to justify immorality. The cowards returned home to bask in the peasants' awe, but survival and the forest had become my life. As the sun descended behind Tazir and his companions, clouds coiled like wraiths about the Colding Hills. Disdain deepens the pitch of Erdmore's story. Enjoy indeed, listening to the biased stories of those soldiers who survived and also chose to remain in Collinsburg. A child might come to believe such a thing. The Baron's current army contains a few good patriots who believe in his causes. In the name of the Most Holy, I would never find fault with a man who fights for what he believes. But most of his men live off the so-called glory of the previous generation. They wear their free uniforms like medals of courage. They hold themselves above their families and display their competence against the helpless, prisoners, beggars, and street orphans. Erdmore fell silent. Tazir gnawed his lower lip, unable to find the right thing to say in the wake of Erdmore's revelations. He recalled the many times Collinsburg's young guardsmen treated his gang brothers with unnecessary cruelty, and the abuse of the beggar woman in an alley near the alehouse. At least for the moment, Tazir felt safer keeping his father's identity hidden. In the wash of emotion which Erdmore's tale inspired, many of the elder Madakin's parables of war and duty took on a new meaning. Moonbear, too, seemed impressed with Erdmore's display. He ceased insisting they turn northward, and allowed Erdmore to steer eastward until they chose to make camp that night. Over a dinner of quail and roots the conversation returned to more benign matters, but memories of Erdmore's descriptions haunted Tazir well after his companions succumbed to sleep. Around a parallel campsite at the base of the cliffs, Illyrian and Mordath stared into a crude rectangle of sorcery. Illyrian studied the slumbering forms of Moonbear and Erdmore. His mouth curled into a bitter smile. This will be simple. No. Mordath's tapering fingernails bit the flesh of Illyrian's forearm like a claw. Never undervalue Erdmore. The snap of a twig could send him skittering into the forest like a deer. Without constant use of my location spell, a service I haven't enough power to provide, we would never find him again. Illyrian licked his lips with dry anticipation. Do you have a spell which could silence the army? Mordath glared. Do you have a sword from which could kill 50 men? If you wish miracles, enlist a god. The best I can do is mute the sound of half a dozen men and their horses. He focused his eyes on Moonbear. I want capable soldiers with me. You, perhaps. Illyrian blanched. I'm along for statecraft and strategy. I can fight, he added carefully, but Salik could serve your purposes better. He is their commander. Salik, then. Mordath screwed up his eyes and advanced nearer to his magics. I can't be certain which of my spells will become necessary in the coming battle, nor how much of my life energy they might drain. We mustn't lose. If the thief reaches the Kattegat Ferry, my promotion to Garnet level of mastery and our chance at wealth may fail. Illyrian's sandy hair bracketed his sharp features. Why is that? Mordath shook his head and refused to answer. Curious, but not wishing to antagonize the sorcerer, Illyrian changed the subject. Where's Tazir? Mordath paused a moment, his eyes distracted as if he collected his thoughts. He's not within the radius of the spell. Can't you channel your energy in on him? Mordath dismissed the image. Not as long as he carries the Jade Stone. If he's tossed it, I can find him. The only way to know for certain is to try. But my life aura is spent whether or not the spell meets with success. I can't waste it. Illyrian climbed to his feet. Come now, let's prepare Salik and his men for battle. With the captain away, Illyrian realized command of the remaining forces might fall to himself. The thought left a pleasant taste in his mouth. Tazir Madakin wandered without a conscious goal. Erdmore's descriptions had cut deeply into his soul. For the first time, he understood the cynicism which had hovered like a cloud about his father, a level of mental isolation which Tazir could never bridge. It had lent the captain an aura of mystery. But now, Tazir thought he could finally understand the torment which had consumed his father's mind, even while in the safe confines of his own home. Each year, eager youths joined under his command. Despite his best attempts at weapons training, every battle claimed more lives. The guilt must have seemed unbearable. Mother's sons came to him, shiny new swords scratched from sparring and training, and he returned them in caskets, or not at all. Tizir's walk took him to the bare face of granite. The pale circle of moonlight revealed a pass through the crags. He crouched in the darkness, uneasy with his own thoughts. Wind whipped strands of hair into his eyes. Even as he brushed it away and wistfully remembered his last visit to Collinsburg's barber, the muffled clink of metal startled him. Tizir went utterly still. Tension chased his skin into gooseflesh. He strained every sense, but only heard the steady hum of cicada and the distant hoo of an owl. The foreign sound did not recur, yet Tizir remained silent several minutes longer. Finally, attributing the noise to imagination, he shook a cramp from his leg. As he moved, 7 zebra steeds with riders emerged from the crossing. Tizir froze. Near enough to recognize Captain Salik Kanathal as well as the dragon rank mage he had robbed in Winnis Tavern, Tizir hoped darkness and inactivity would hide him from their sight. The scene seemed strangely unreal, but the early stirrings of excitement convinced him the guardsmen were no dream. One of the steeds snorted. The sound emerged no louder than a whisper. The phenomenon was not lost on Tizir. 7 enemies on horseback, moving with no more sound than a fox. How? No answers came, but Tizir knew it had something to do with the blond wizard who, even mounted, held his staff aloft with blithe confidence. The guardsmen dismounted. The red-trimmed uniforms which had filled Tizir with excitement as a child now seemed a mockery of glory and justice. Apparently oblivious to Tizir's presence, the soldiers hobbled their horses. Mordath's gaze swept the crags unhurriedly. Tizir held his breath as the emerald stare played over him. But the sorcerer made no sign he had seen Tizir. Instead, he followed the guardsmen into the scrub pines toward the dense copse of trees, which hid Moonbear's and Erdmore's camp. Concern struck like madness. Tizir fingered his sword hilt, aware he could not hope to battle a sorcerer with capabilities beyond his understanding, and 6 warriors as well. The moment he revealed himself by sound or gesture, he would die. He knew he could serve his companions better alive and unnoticed by Mordath, but he did not want the sorcerer and his followers to catch Erdmore and Moonbear sleeping. Burdened with unsatisfying options, Tizir trailed Mordath with the stealth he had gained from his last few days in the woods. Tizir stopped at the border of the camp. Mordath halted no more than 10 steps away. The soldiers continued forward, slow and silent in the gloom. Tizir shivered. He clung to a tree trunk, bark gouged his chest. He waited, hoping the soldiers would make some noise to betray them and awaken Moonbear. But the men moved, ominous as shadows in the unnatural quiet of Mordath's spell. Still Tizir waited, aware that the guard's necessity to capture Moonbear alive would buy him some time. He watched as the soldiers split into unequal groups. Salik led 3 to the far side of Moonbear, and the remaining 2 poised over Erdmore. Irony penetrated the urgency which goaded Tizir to action. They too recall the battle in Winnith. They won't underestimate Moonbear again. With this realization, Tizir stared in dreamlike detachment as Salik approached Moonbear, the haft of his sword raised for a stunning blow. Another Collinsburgan positioned himself over Erdmore. Now devoid of choices, Tizir cried out a warning. Suddenly, Erdmore moved. The bow in his fist swung in a wild arc. It crashed against the legs of a guardsman, staggering him. The maneuver gained Erdmore enough space to stand. Hurling the bow at his other assailant, he drew his sword to do battle. The last dying coals of the campfire lit the steel red as blood. Moonbear awoke no less swiftly. His huge hand locked on Salik's ankle and jerked inward. Off balance, the captain's blow fell short. With his free hand, Moonbear drew his sword. Its blade skimmed across Salik's abdomen. The captain screamed, a sickening, strangled sound thanks to Mordath's magic. Moonbear changed the direction of his strike. He buried his sword in Salik's ribs as the other 3 guardsmen closed in on him. The sight of Salik's violent death made Tizir's stomach twitch. A hard glimmer of blue-white light drew his eye. The sky went suddenly dark as storm. Thunder boomed. The gem in Mordath's staff blazed green fire. Lightning flared across the heavens. It shot downward in a bolt of incandescence, which bounced from the gemstone and shot straight for Tizir. Tizir dove aside. He struck the ground hard, rolled to his feet, and dodged behind a tree. Behind him, the backlash of Mordath's spell streaked ruddy sparks across the forest floor. The odor of ozone seemed suffocating. A sinuous twist of steam rose into the treetops. Mordath screamed a coarse blasphemy. Tizir cringed behind Bark, as the sorcerer's ruthless gaze sought him in the brush. Driven backward, the two guards battling Ardmore came dangerously close to Mordath. Self-defense forced the sorcerer's attention to them. In the brief reprieve, Tizir freed his sword and raced down on Mordath's unshielded back. A rush of panic turned Tizir's limbs weak as rags. Memories of his mother's slaying came unbidden. His skin wept clammy sweat. His hands felt wet with the recollection of blood he could never wash away. He fumbled the sword in his grip. Karanis damned, not now! But morality burned his conscience like hellfire. He could not raise his hands to kill again. Mordath backstepped. Exhaustion robbed him of his unusual arrogant grace. The distant crash of steel revealed that the guardsman's sound-muting spell covered only the guardsman, and by the sound, Moonbear at least was still up and fighting. Again, Tizir tried to turn his sword on Mordath. His pulse pounded in his ears. Dizziness swam through his head. Fatigue tempered Mordath's movements. He made a muffled noise of concession. Lightning cracked open the heavens. It struck the green depths of Mordath's stone and shattered in twain. The energies raged forward with a human scream, half-plowed into Ardmore, dropping him to the ground. The remainder shot for Moonbear. The bolt struck, scattering starred points of light. The barbarian plummeted, and Mordath, too, fell to the ground in a silent faint. For several seconds no one moved. The guardsmen stood like crafted statues. Tizir slunk into the trees, heavy with guilt and anguish. The storm clouds dispersed as rapidly as a lifted veil, making the moon seem unusually brilliant. Tizir waited in restless horror for some sign of life from his friends. Similarly concerned, the guardsmen ran to their captain, but even from the farther side of the camp, Tizir could see that Salik lay in an unnatural position. Blood stained the leaves around him like wine. Tizir felt bitterly cold. A breeze wove through the brush, laminating the senseless loss of lives in the clearing. Sprawled around Moonbear's prone form, 2 other guardsmen lay dead. The 3 survivors checked bodies in grim silence. One glanced up from Moonbear. Apparently, Mordath's spell had faded, for his words wafted softly to Tizir's ears. "This one's alive." The man with Ardmore raised his head. "This one too." Relief flooded through Tizir, but the third man's reply sent a shiver through them. "Kill them, then. Let's be done with this." His sword rasped from its sheath. Another guard seized his eager companion's wrist. "Wald, are you possessed? The Baron commanded us to bring the barbarian back alive, and Salik insisted we leave Ardmore unharmed as well." He unclipped a length of heavy rope from his belt. "Bind them, guard your back and your tongue, the thief's out there somewhere." Grudgingly, Wald knotted the line around Moonbear and Ardmore. The third Collinsbergen approached Mordath and pressed his fingers to the sorcerer's throat. "A Garen's gold. Strangest thing, there's not a mark on him. His heart's going, but slowly, like he's asleep or something." The guard who had rescued Moonbear from his companion's angry thrust made a religious gesture. "Leave him there. Didn't you see what he did? He commands a god's powers. Who can guess what may come of even a touch?" The soldier shrank away from Mordath. His red cuffs flicked back to reveal crisscrossing scars of battle. He returned to his companions and addressed the men who appeared to have taken command. "What now, Derek? Back to the horses?" "No." Derek examined Moonbear's bonds with satisfaction. "We're all tired. Illyria knows where we are. We can't risk moving the captives in the dark." Illyrian's name charged hatred through Tizir. So, the traitor joined the hunt, as if he hasn't done me enough damage. Prickling with impatience, he waited while the guards settled for the night at the farther edge of camp. Derek and his unnamed companion sprawled near their captives. Wald remained awake and watchful, guarding the perimeter with a darting gaze. Already, Tizir could see Ardmore stirring within his bonds. Not far from his own position, Mordath lay in a supernatural sleep, his life aura nearly emptied on a desperate spell. Night intensified, cloaking the camp in gray-black mist. Tizir could no longer discern more than silhouettes at the opposite side of the clearing. A brief conversation revealed that both of his companions were now conscious. Moonbear's crisp sing-song rose in question. "Where is Shadow?" Wald replied with unconcealed hatred. "He's dead, you repulsive animal, just like my captain." Tizir winced, aware Moonbear could not know the guardman's statement was a bold-faced lie. He felt the deep pain which must have twisted through the naive and kind-hearted barbarian. Tizir read no intention in the ensuing silence, but he knew he would need to act quickly. Daylight would bring the army and destroy any chance of rescue. Wald's alert presence by the prisoners made any attempts to free Moonbear and Ardmore impossible. Somehow, Tizir would need to lure the guardsman from his post. Again, Tizir studied the comatose sorcerer. Sleep softened Mordath's chiseled features, lending him an air of childlike innocence. Surely he carries some object which could be used to distract a soldier. Dropping to his belly, Tizir slithered toward the dragon-rank mage. Even in slumber, Mordath's bearing and the carven staff at his side seemed intimidating. Tizir hesitated, affected by Derek's warning to his companion. Until his encounter with Mordath and Wynneth, Tizir would have dismissed the idea of magic, mortal or god-sanctioned. Handling Mordath or his possessions might well prove dangerous. Immediately, Tizir found a flaw in his own logic. I robbed him with impunity in Wynneth's tavern. He would never have noticed a jade was missing without its revealing flash. He caught the hem of Mordath's robes. With the quick, capable hands of a professional, he emptied the sorcerer's pockets. Tizir found Mordath's effects disappointingly normal. His search revealed only a handkerchief, a pouch of coins, a gaudy silver ring, and a small knife with an ivory hilt studded with tiny emeralds. The haft was worn smooth from use, the blade clean and well tended. At least now I have something less bulky than a sword to cut bindings. Uncertain whether he could find any use for the other objects, he transferred them to his own pocket. Wald shifted position with a loud rustle. Tizir paused, not daring movement. There followed the scratch of a twig against dirt as the guardsman drew bored circles in the dust. Mordath stirred slightly, then again went still. Only a fool could surrender an opportunity to slay an opponent this strong, but Tizir recognized his conscience as a witness more dreadful than any man. I couldn't even take Mordath's life to save my friends. I certainly can't do it now. Cursing his weakness, Tizir prepared to leave. His gaze fell on the dragonstaff. Its jadestone still shimmered, like the few persistent rays which follow the sunset. I can't kill him, but perhaps I can cripple his power. Filled with new purpose, Tizir crawled to the dragonstaff. 4 black-nailed toes gripped the jadestone like a vice. Grasping the dagger, Tizir steadied his trembling hands. He set the sharpened edge against the darkly stained surface of one claw. With quiet, deliberate strokes, he sawed through the wood. Chips flaked into his palm. After several cuts, one toenail snapped free. The knife blade scratched across the surface of the jadestone. Light streamed from the injured gem like blood. Mordath cried out from his trance. Instinct flattens Tizir to the leaf-strewn ground. To his relief, the gem's beam faded to darkness. Mordath groaned, rolled, and dropped back into sleep. Wald leaped to his feet. His sandy hair seemed beaded with moonlight, framing his shadowed face. He peered through the darkness, studying the sorcerer. Then he looked back at his sleeping companions. With a shrug of feigned disinterest, he returned to his idle dust pictures. Afraid to risk waking the sorcerer, Tizir gave up his attack on the staff. Carefully, he crawled to the perimeter. Hoping the insect chorus would mask the sounds of his passage, he worked his way slowly around the clearing. He kept his attention fixed alternately on his route and Wald. The sentry occasionally turned his eyes to Mordath. Apparently, curiosity warred with his natural mistrust of the supernatural. Wald stood upright. He threw a brief glance around the clearing. Satisfied nothing had changed, he headed toward Mordath. Tizir quickened his pace, hoping Mordath and his flawed staff would hold Wald's attention long enough for him to take action. Ahead, Moonbear's tremendous bulk appeared reassuringly familiar. Tizir recovered the remaining distance in a bound. He set the knife to Moonbear's bonds. The barbarian went taut, resisting. Tizir put his mouth to his companion's ear and whispered, "It's Shadow. Be still until I free Erdmore." The razor edge of Mordath's dagger sliced through the ropes. Having cut Moonbear loose, Tizir started on Erdmore. A glance in Wald's direction revealed the sentry returning at a trot. Tizir chopped faster. The strands broke with a hiss of parting hemp. Moonbear and Erdmore struggled to their feet. Wald shouted. His companions responded sluggishly. Swords whipped free, silvered by moonlight. Tizir ran toward the cliff. This way. Realizing a sprint into the woods seemed a more sensible move, he added, "Trust me." Erdmore followed on Tizir's heels, but Moonbear remained behind long enough to reclaim his and Erdmore's swords. Tizir slowed. Erdmore caught his arm. "Moonbear will catch up with us. No need for another battle." Steel chimed a grim suffix to Erdmore's words. Concerned for Moonbear, Tizir turned. Reflected moonbeams highlighted the barbarian moving toward them rapidly. Behind, the shadowy figures of the 3 guardsmen gave chase. The forest opened out suddenly. Tizir wound through the scrub pine into the open ground before the cliff face. A horse's snort echoed eerily along the crags. Striped necks lifted, arched tautly. Mount up quickly. Tizir brandished Mordas's dagger, carefully slashing the steed's hobbles. Ardmore sprang to a mount's back. Tizir climbed to the withers of a muscular mare and clutched the reins of the gelding he'd chosen for Moonbear in a fist gone slick with sweat. The barbarian ran to him and stopped before the striped animal. Distress wrinkled the skin around his eyes. Not again. Too stressed to see the humor in the situation, Tizir patted the gelding's flank. Get on and hold tight. We must ride along the cliffs. Only a madman would gallop at night through forest. He held the horse until Moonbear settled into a seat, then kicked his own steed into a canter.